Hey, everybody, welcome back to the next chapter in our ongoing exploration of the story. This time around, we are looking at chapter 8, which is entitled A Few Good Men and Women. This chapter is loosely covering the book of Judges from within the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to give some history, kind of some background, more about the book of Judges itself, rather than really delving into the individual narrative or the individual stories that we find in there. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I kind of want to talk about some themes that emerge from Judges as a whole. Now, Judges itself is described by various scholars as a very loose connection of stories that are taken from the various tribes of Israel that really highlight some of their heroic leaders. It covers a period of history from the culture of Israel that goes between the death of Joshua to just before the establishment of the actual nation of Israel under King Saul. Now we'll see that happen in the book of 1 Samuel, and that's kind of coming up for us. But this period of history is roughly 150 to 200 years. Again, we don't know exactly because there is a whole lot of ambiguity in terms of these stories and when exactly they take place within that overarching history. Now, it's important to note just how fractured Israel as a whole is at this time. Now, we had Moses first and then Joshua, who led them as an entire culture. Joshua, in particular, through the period of conquest within the promised land. But a generation later, which is kind of where this picks up, things have gotten very, 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 highlight very, very, very tribal in nature. If you think about the 12 tribes of Israel. Sometimes these different tribes get along, sometimes they don't. And even within the tribes, there are clans within the various tribes and the different communities where they might be centered. Remember, at this time in history, your close proximity, those were your people. And that's who you hung out with, and that's who you protected and cared about. So we have various clans within the tribes, and then the 12 tribes that make up the culture of Israel. Now, sometimes they got along and sometimes they didn't. Oftentimes we hear about them fighting with one another every bit as much as we hear about them fighting with other cultures. Now, each of the judges that we hear about, both within the story as well as in the larger biblical narrative of Judges, was very likely connected with one or perhaps a few of those tribes. Very likely not all 12. So sometimes when we hear that they led Israel, that's probably more saying that they led this section of Israelites, or they led some of the Israelites, but really not, like, don't think of them as a king or as a president or thing of that nature overseeing the entire nation. That's really not the best way to think about this. Now, take away from all this historical background, this period was really messy. And the stories that are featured here and in the entirety of Judges are not really linear. It's not really like this person and then this person and then this person and this person. And they're not all encompassing of the entire culture. That's really kind of what I want you to take away from this first thing that I've been talking about. Now, moving on from there, a general cycle that we see, or a theme that we see within the book of Judges, kind of goes like this. The people fail to follow God. They also oftentimes end up worshiping other gods. And you might recall, I think I talked about this last time, that the idea of monotheism was really not really highly thought of. There were other gods and neighboring gods besides just God, or Yahweh, or whatever we want to call him, the Lord. So even within the Israelite culture, God was the God, but there were other gods too. So maybe that's where this kind of gets a little bit blurry, is there are other gods, and well, these people over here seem like they're doing better than we are, so maybe we should pay attention to their God. That's probably where some of this comes from. But let me back up. Sorry, I went on a little tangent there. So the people don't follow God and they begin to worship other gods. Baal is one that we actually hear about, and that's one that we hear about through quite a bit of the history of the region, probably because of the cultural influence of their neighbors. Because of this, God removes favor from the people. The neighboring cultures dominate and they control or sometimes oppress the Israelites, or at least the local tribe or local clans. Then the people remember God and they cry out. We have echoes of Egypt here, like, oh, deliver us, Lord. God raises up a deliverer of sorts, which we hear as judges here, or they're called judges. Oftentimes, they're kind of military minded, so they're probably pretty strong and they're good fighters. Not entirely, though. We also kind of hear about people who seem more like prophets. So they speak for God, but they don't necessarily like these strong military leaders. Through the judge, God does deliver the people. They do overthrow the oppressors, and the people will honor God and live in peace until the judge dies, and then the cycle seems to repeat itself. Within the biblical account, we hear of about 12 different judges. 6 of them are considered major, and namely, we get a lot of story for them. And 6 of them are pretty minor, which we kind of get them mentioned in passing and that they overthrew these people and they led for this long. And then that's kind of the end of their story. So we've got some major ones and we've got some minor ones that kind of come up with us. Of the major ones, here within the story, we hear about 4, 3 in particular, 3 in depth. And it's worth noting the very radical differences that we see as we consider their different stories, their differences in personality and their differences in leadership style and kind of just the general focus and theme of their story. The general cycle might be the same throughout that we see kind of repeated, but their individual stories are different, and it's understandable because they're different people. Also worth noting, I think this is important to consider in the book of Judges, that we might have what we could call a fairly favorable portrayal of women within the narrative. And favorable is maybe open to interpretation, but it is worth noting women seem to have a lot more agency here in this section than compared with what we've seen before. They're not necessarily portrayed as just secondary characters that are there to support the men, and they're overshadowed and overpowered by the men. Deborah, one of our judges, is of course a woman. We hear about Jael, who is responsible for killing an enemy commander. That's also connected with Deborah's story. But we hear about both of Samson's wives. He's got one wife and then he's got a different wife later on, that take active roles in the story because of their own motivations. And I think this is a switch in tone from what we've seen. It's maybe favorable is not the right word for it, but it's a switch, and I appreciate the agency that women have within the book of Judges. I think that's a good thing, even if their motivations maybe aren't so great. So that being said, now, real quick, the 4 judges that we hear about, the first one we hear about is Othniel. Now, Othniel, his story is pretty brief, but he was the first judge. And what's interesting to note about him, I think, says a little bit about why he may have had some authority in the first place, because he is the nephew of Caleb. Now, Caleb sounds familiar. Caleb, along with Joshua, were the only 2 of the original spies that came back with favorable reports, and they were the only 2 that were allowed to basically live beyond that first generation that wandered. So Caleb would have been a name that was known among the people, and Othniel is his nephew. So he's got that connection to a little bit of prestige. That's probably why people would have listened to him in the first place. So Othniel is the first one we hear about, but we only hear a little bit, and then we kind of move on. Then we have Deborah. Deborah is portrayed not so much as a judge herself. Well, no, let me take that back. She is a judge, but she's not so much considered to be the military-minded person, the military leader. She's really more of a prophet that we see in that. But she partners with Barak, who is the military leader. So Deborah is an important one. Then we have Gideon. Gideon does seem to be a bit of a military leader, though his military prowess seems to stem from using his wits rather than force. And he actually seems a little bit timid in a lot of ways throughout his story. And then we have Samson. Samson's his story really talks about his exploits that stem from an almost superhero-like strength that is given to him through God. Much of his story, though, rather than focusing on him leading, really just sort of focuses on him and the stuff that he does rather than his leadership of the people. So those are kind of the 4 main people that we hear about, and really 3 of the 4 that are probably a little bit more in depth. Now, as per usual, I want to talk about some of the problematic stuff, some of the things that make me go, that I don't quite know what to think about or to make of, and I think are worth thinking about. It's somewhat implied, in fact, I think there's kind of a throwaway comment, that a lot of the conflict that we see between the Israelite culture, or at least groups from within it, and then the neighboring cultures are really at the heart of all this. And perhaps that's not surprising because that was the world that they lived in at the time. But there's this comment that kind of happens. It sort of makes me go, that these nations that are in conflict with Israel are the ones that Joshua failed to drive out. Now, we kind of heard about this last week. I think I kind of mentioned this last week too. These cultures don't worship God, or at least not predominantly. But I ask the question, does that make them quote unquote evil, or does that make them quote unquote the bad guys? I tend to find that whole good guy, bad guy, or that dichotomy between good and evil, good guy, bad guy. Sometimes we'll say, is it a black and white type situation? In terms of, let me back that up. When we call like a problem, it's a black or white answer. That's all this kind of stuff. That dichotomy, I find that troublesome because I don't think either side is really innocent. Samson's a good example of this. He was a shepherd. No, a shepherd. I can't read my own writing. He was a shrewd hothead who often murdered people because he either felt slighted or because it was convenient for him. So while his exploits are interesting, and they are, he's maybe not the best example of a good guy. In light of current events, I think that this theme, it's also applicable, and it's also important to think about. So much fighting and tension and conflict, I think both now as well as what we find within the narrative, it seems to stem from, we think this land is ours, or this is our home. And why? Well, because our God says so. And then when we get right down to it, we also remember that history tends to be written by the victors. So we won, so I guess our God was better. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that or how to think about that, but this is stuff that I think about, and this is some of the things that make me go, as I ponder on this history, which again, I appreciate and I like it. It's actually one of my favorite Old Testament books, but it really is, I think, applicable to some things that are going on in the world right now that should make us stop and think about the importance of human life and the ways that I believe God does care for all of humanity, even in times when perhaps it doesn't seem like it or feel like it. So enjoy the discussion. Thanks, everybody.